Well, good afternoon. I wanted to begin today's presentation by highlighting and responding of sorts to some of the current conversation we're having across this country as it relates to some executive actions that the President of the United States took over the weekend. So many calls, overwhelming number of calls we've received inquiring about whether or not the state of California will participate in the new unemployment insurance efforts that the President tried to formalize over the weekend. Accordingly, questions remain, abundant number of inquiries remain around the issue of evictions here in the state of California. Two of the most pressing, two of the most important and consequential issues facing the state and states all across this country. As it relates to California's specific role and responsibility, as it relates to providing unemployment and the PUA claims that we do on a daily basis, we've been talking about for months here as a state, we analyzed the federal proposal that the President has put together and analyze what the expected costs and associated benefits and liabilities would be of advancing the program. While we've not been shy for many, many months in our desire and our advocacy to see a deal at the federal level, to see an effort of compromise, an effort that has been advocated for months now by Speaker Nancy Pelosi to provide an additional stimulus to this country, individuals, not just states and local governments. The House led in this effort a number of months ago, over $3 trillion relief package that met our goals and met our expectations. We obviously were left wanting, a little disappointed that things did not advance, particularly through the end of next week. As a consequence, the President put forward these presidential memorandum as it relates to an executive order, and clearly those executive orders do not meet the totality of need and the totality of requests that governors of all political stripes, mayors, and the like, advocates and individuals expected of the federal government. As it relates, though, specifically, again, to the unemployment capacity of the state of California, if we picked up, as the President proposed, 25% of the costs associated with an increase of $400, again, we had a $600 very successful $600 contribution that expired on July 25th. We have been waiting for Congress. We've been waiting for the President to respond to that. Unfortunately, there was a disconnect, and as a consequence, that program no longer exists, and there's been no bridge. The bridge program, however, we believe or hope a bridge program to the future as it relates to restarting these conversations federally is this $400, not $600 additional contribution. The responsibility under this new executive order, this presidential memorandum, is responsibility for the states to pick up 25% of the costs. As you can see from this slide, that cost would inure to the state of California, its taxpayers, roughly $700 million per week. If that fund, and it's a fund that has limited resources, $70 billion currently, if that fund drops to $25 billion or less, then those federal dollars disappear. If the state of California was to absorb those costs, you're looking at $2.8 billion every week of state resources that we would have to find, programs we'd otherwise have to cut, or revenue we would have to generate to make up for that gap. We have already allocated in excess of 75% of our CARES Act funding pursuant to the Budget Act, pursuant to the budget that I just signed. We received as a state a little over $15 billion, incredibly gratified by that support, which has been foundational and instrumental in our ability to address some of the most vexing and challenging issues 40 million Californians face. Those dollars have been obliged. Those dollars have been deliberated in terms of the efficacy and prudence of where those dollars we felt were best invested according to the federal guidelines of which they are conditioned. 75+% of that, again, has already been obligated and distributed. The rest of the money simply does not exist, meaning, it's a long way of saying this, the state does not have an identified resource of $700 million per week that we haven't already obliged. There is no money sitting in the piggy bank of the previous CARES Act to be reprioritized or reconstituted for this purpose. Simply does not exist. And for the state to absorb $700 million per week, potentially close to $3 billion per week, when, not if, the identified $70 billion fund the president is looking to draw down from, would create a burden the likes which even a state as large as California can never absorb without, again, massive cuts to important services or further burdening, as we say in this slide, businesses and individuals. Let me take a closer look, or let's take a closer look at some of the requirements. This is a new program. This program, again, requires unique stipulation of considerations, response from individuals. A consequence, we would have to reprogram a system that is well-defined, is hardly perfect at EDD. For those of you that are shaking your head, I recognize the magnitude of the challenge, the burden that we already have with our unemployment insurance system. We've got a strike team. We have strategies. We have an approach to address this issue, medium and long term. But the reality of reprogramming that system from $600 down to $400, coming up with an identifiable fund source, eliminating the benefits to those that receive over $100 or less than $100 a week, all of those burdens would create time delays and would create enormous consternation for millions of those that would seek those benefits. I want to remind you, this executive order is a very different approach than what has historically been the approach with unemployment insurance. Usually the federal government, particularly in times of emergency, fronts the money, recognizing the state constraints, recognizing the scarcity of resources during an economic crisis. We have unemployment that is worse than we've seen since the Great Depression. As a consequence, our underemployment rates, those seeking full-time jobs and only have part-time jobs, those numbers are substantially higher than even the national recorded numbers and the state numbers that we'll be putting out very, very shortly. Enormous economic strife, enormous economic stress, historic amount of unemployment insurance that we have been providing. We need the federal government to front those dollars. We simply do not have the capacity. Again, even a state as large and well-resourced and as well-managed in terms of our reserves and our capacity to borrow, we're simply just not in that position. So I wanted to up front talk about the proposal coming from the president this weekend. We're looking for all the additional support we possibly can find. If we're going to land at $400, not $600, that would be advantageous compared to nothing for millions of Californians. But we're going to need the federal government to provide the support on that 25%, or we are at peril of being in a position where we're making false commitments, false promises to millions of Californians that ultimately we simply cannot meet. Accordingly, the question of evictions, as I said, has been top of mind, top of our agenda as an administration going back to March. We signed our first executive order on evictions on March 16th, providing clarifications and guidance to local governments. In the next slide, I'll show you how many local governments have enacted some moratoria as it relates to evictions and provided some local supports. We recognize not every municipality, every jurisdiction was going to provide those supports. And a few weeks later, 11 days later, we signed a second executive order related to evictions, providing statewide protections. That was codified by the Judicial Council. We afforded the Judicial Council some autonomy to halt evictions, to provide other autonomy in terms of making decisions in real time. One of them, and we're very grateful for that leadership of the Judicial Council, was a rule to halt statewide evictions that codified sorts what I put out on the 27th. Now, that was done on April 6th. That eviction moratorium that came from the Judicial Council potentially expires this month. And there was some suggestion it may expire as early as August 14th, putting a lot of stress and a lot of concern and anxiety around evictions, at least here in the state of California, and real sharp focus. We have been working overtime with our legislative leaders. We're in meetings, including today, on this topic. We have a legislative session that expires at the end of this month, and we have every hope and expectation that we will organize a framework, collaborative framework, to get to a place where we collectively, the legislature and the executive branch, with the broad strokes capacity of the Judicial Council to provide some subsequent clarifications. Ultimately, we hope potentially expanding into the later part of this month their adopted rule on halting evictions, giving us a little bit more time. And so wanted to be upfront about that. We've talked about that last week, previous weeks, about these efforts. Just want folks to know we have been working very collaboratively with advocacy groups, not just legislative leaders, to formulate a strategy to address this real concern. Again, this concern only highlighted by the lack of activity and lack of action in terms of a compromise at the federal level. Remember, though, Speaker Pelosi led with strategies to address this months ago. Unfortunately, we were all put as American citizens in this position because of the inability to formulate a compromise last week. I appreciate there was some extension of consideration to this made by the president, but it was more along the lines of studying this issue, providing some capacity at HUD and elsewhere to move on this. But we need something much more specific, much more directed, and we, again, are working overtime to advance just that. I should note, referenced a moment ago, we have roughly 50% of Californians currently living in jurisdictions that have some form of moratoria in place related to evictions. 80 cities, as you see in this slide, some 10 counties. But 10 counties is not 58. 80 cities is not 470 plus cities that exist in this state. And we recognize, again, the stress of those living outside of those jurisdictions as it relates to the concern around making ends meet, particularly in relationship to losing that $600, the ambiguity and questions around the additional $400, and the position we're in with these current executive orders running their course. It also should be noted, and cannot be said enough, though we have been very consistent over the course of the last number of months to talk in terms of racial and ethnic issues related to health broadly. Social determinants of health has been part of a mantra, I think, of what makes California special, particularly as it relates to its healthcare delivery system, is there's a framework of cultural competency, but still those disparities persist, and they have been exacerbated clearly in this crisis. Just to underscore that, there was a very comprehensive survey done recently of the number of individuals that are at risk of evictions. And you can see in this second bullet point on this slide, about 3/4 of renters in the state that have fallen behind in rent represented in the Latino and African American community, the Latinx and Black community, 62% of the Latino community, close to 10% in the Black community. So it underscores this lens of equity, issues of disparity. 3/4 of renters that have fallen behind in this category. So when we talk about the issue of evictions, we need to consider this very jaw-dropping, pointed stat that for many of you is not surprising. For others of you, if it is, it's important to consider that in the context of this debate, both nationally, statewide, and clearly locally. Again, working with the legislature, address these issues, and as soon as we have information back, we will be providing it. On the issue of equity, I also want to make case that philanthropy has really begun to step up in a meaningful way. We're announcing today a new philanthropic effort led by Kaiser that is providing some $63 million in new grant funding to provide community-based supports to partner with the state of California and counties to address the issue of contact tracing, isolation, and quarantine efforts. Now, it is self-evident to all of you as the numbers come down in terms of the total number of cases, positivity rate, total number of hospitalizations and ICUs. We'll share that information in a moment, that it becomes even more essential that we focus, in a very focused way, our efforts on addressing issues of isolation and quarantine. What we don't want are essential workers. We talked about this last week and the previous week, that essential workforce that has no capacity because they're not getting supports in terms of sick leave and supports in terms of workers' comp, that they go to work even if they've been exposed to the virus, in some cases even if they know that they're positive, putting other people at risk. But they do so out of some desperation for their livelihood. It is foundational in our efforts to ultimately not only bend this curve, but to eliminate this virus, that we support people in times of need, particularly multi-generation families, particularly low-income families that simply don't have the support or capacity to isolate, to quarantine. And so while the state is doing more, we announced, you may recall, $150 million commitment using CDC funding over a week or so ago. We are reaching out to the philanthropic community to do even more. And today, again, we're announcing a $63 million commitment in grant funding from Kaiser. And this support will support CBOs to focus on cultural competency, to focus on cultural humility in terms of our efforts to train our contact tracers. I want to thank the Skoll Foundation, for example, providing just shy of $700,000 specifically for that to supplement the efforts at UCSF and UCLA to focus even more granularly on cultural humility, on cultural competency efforts. That's part of the philanthropic thrust that is in addition to the $63 million Kaiser's providing. That's represented in the $18.8 million additional philanthropic commitment that we have received. We have a goal, by the way, internal goal, $25 million, already $18.8 million has been provided. These dollars go, in addition to the $63 million, go to help pay utilities, go to help pay for move-in costs if someone needs to move into a temporary location. We've talked about our efforts to provide hotel rooms and vouchers and other supports, but there's the intangible costs that sometimes are barriers. That's food, broader social services. And so that's the purpose, the bucket that's represented in this slide and these efforts. Again, in the lens of cultural competency, in the lens that we must look through as it relates to this crisis, disproportionately impacting the Latino community and the Black community. By the way, I'll in a moment be talking about the new case numbers that came out today, but just consider the numbers that I will share in a moment after Dr. Galley comes up. Those numbers of positive cases, 58.8% of them that we'll announce today, close to 60% positive numbers that impacted the Latino community directly, underscoring the disparity, underscoring the purpose of these resources and these broader efforts on UI, on evictions, on the issue of quarantining people and isolating people, tracing people, and as always, testing individuals. With all of that, let me, before I bring up Dr. Galley, make some comments about information. It is clear, based upon what has been reported over the last week, that we have had a little bit of trouble in what we refer to as our Cal-Ready system. I can regale you about large-scale IT here in the state of California, and I can assure you